G'day guys, Will here, welcome back to the channel. So today's video we're talking about 10 things that I wish I'd known before I spent a cent on any of the sim racing gear that you see in front of me now. So it's important to acknowledge before we get into this video that quite a lot of the gear that I do have was provided either at a discounted rate or for free by various different companies. So Next Level Racing provided the FGT cockpit that I had originally when I first started doing sim racing videos, as well as the GT track that I have now. They also gave me a discounted rate on the motion platform that I'm sitting on, and BenQ very kindly supplied the 335-inch EX3501R monitors that I'm using as well. So that has had a little bit of a bearing on the order in which I've done things and the upgrade path that I've taken. But having said that, it hasn't sort of influenced the actual products that I've ended up with, and it definitely has taught me a thing or two about, you know, the right order to buy things, what kind of gear you should be getting, and, you know, the kind of direction that you want to take if you're wanting to get into sim racing for the first time. So whether you're completely new to the world of sim racing, or maybe you already have a little bit of gear and you're just wondering how you can get the absolute most for the money that you've already spent, or maybe you're wanting to invest in some upgrades into the future, you'll definitely be learning something in this video, so stick around. Okay, so we've got a list of 10 things that we're going to be working our way through here, but I'm going to split it into two main sections. The first section revolving more around the hardware side of things, and then the second section revolving more around the overall experience of racing, competing online and stuff like that. So let's start off with number one. Field of view. So field of view makes a absolutely massive difference, much bigger difference than you think. And if you'd seen some of my earlier racing videos, particularly where I was doing F1 2018, you would have seen I had a crazy wide field of view on the 55-inch Samsung screen that I was using at the time. Now, the reason I was doing it, and I was kind of a little bit argumentative about this. A lot of people were saying to me, your field of view is completely wrong and you need to fix it. And I was kind of being resistive and saying, I didn't want to fix the field of view. I wanted to have a nice wide field of view because I wanted to be able to see what was going on around me. Because I was doing league racing primarily, I didn't want to narrow down my field of view and lose the perspective of being able to see cars alongside me and see my mirrors and things like that. What I didn't realize is just how much that actually affects how you drive the car. Having the view set really far back actually means that you lose that sensation of the car sort of moving around underneath you. The car pivots around the center, and when your field of view is too far back, you actually don't feel the car sliding, or the car feels like it's sliding when it isn't. And I found that when I corrected my field of view, I was actually able to control the car a lot better. Not only hitting apexes more accurately, but also catching slides and things like that. Being able to compensate in turns for little tiny twitches and movements in the car made a massive difference. So definitely would recommend taking the time to make sure that your field of view is set correctly, regardless of the sim that you're driving and the type of car that you're driving as well. Now, there's a bunch of field of view calculators that are available online, and I'll link a few of my favorites for you in the description below, but definitely put the time into making sure that your field of view is set correctly. And regardless of whether you're running a 4:3 aspect ratio, 16:9, or even an ultra wide 21:9 or something like that, it is absolutely vital that you set your field of view correctly. And don't be worried about losing the peripheral vision, because it is less important to overall speed than having a wide field of view so you can see what's going on around you. So point number one, field of view. Three screens are much better than one big screen. Now, this obviously will depend on the amount of space that you have available, but this is something that I think this is probably the most costly mistake that I made from the onset. I went out when I first bought my steering wheel and I went and bought a big 55-inch widescreen TV that I had mounted up really close. I thought this is going to be perfect because it's nice and close to me. I've got a massive field of view. And indeed, when I first installed it and I first got everything set up, I actually did think that it was really awesome because, you know, I was having to look around what I was doing. I was having to actually turn my head to see the mirrors and things like that. And I thought, you know, this is incredible. This is amazing. And I felt like I'd made the right decision. And it wasn't until I actually upgraded to triple screens that I really realized the mistake that I'd made. Now, the only reason I actually upgraded to triple screens was because BenQ reached out to me and offered me very kindly the 335-inch monitors to test out. if I hadn't done that, I probably would have stuck with the 55-inch screen at least until I went along the VR pathway, which is still going to happen. But yeah, as soon as I had the triple screen set up, I realized the mistake that I'd made. And this is something that I think is really important to understand. Having a big field of view and having to look around you inside the rig or inside the setting is very different from actually having the perspective of something wrapping around you. So when you're seeing things whizzing past you in real life, you're looking to the side, and your peripheral vision is based on things moving past you. So when you set up the perspective and field of view inside your sim racing titles, you're actually wanting to set it so that you've got that sort of 45 to 50 to 60 degree angle on your side monitors. And if you don't do that, you find that instead of looking at a mirror that's sort of beside you, you're looking at a mirror that is sort of in front of you, and it's not really very realistic at all. So it's kind of like a distorted perspective that you get. And what I found is that having a triple screen setup actually gives you a lot more immersion when you're driving, because you're actually, you're placed inside a cockpit and you're actually seeing things wrapping around you. And I was a little bit concerned about having relatively shallow screens as well. These 35-inch screens aren't particularly tall. But what I'm finding is that because the field of view is set correctly and it's actually wrapping around me, it's a lot more immersive and I'm able to drive a lot more accurately. Obviously, different titles support triple screens in different ways. The Codemasters titles, unfortunately, at this point in time at least, don't allow you to adjust for the angles, so you still kind of get that little sort of stretch that's happening on the sides. Titles like iRacing, Assetto Corsa, Race Room, things like that all allow you to actually adjust and compensate for the angles on the sides, and that allows you to really sort of have that perspective of the mirror kind of being where it would be in real life. And jumping in a real car versus jumping in this now, you actually really do have a very realistic field of view, and it makes you a lot faster with your turn-in and things like that. You can really spot your apexes and aim for them a lot more accurately, as well as it giving you a better perspective of what's going on around you. With the single screen kind of stretched out perspective, you really just don't have that same level of immersion. So that is probably the single biggest mistake that I've made in terms of money that I've spent on things that I probably would have done differently if I'd had my time again. So I would definitely recommend, if you do have the space for it, obviously having a single big screen works perfectly fine if that's all you have the room for. And I'm not trying to discourage you from buying a large screen TV to use for your sim rig, but if you do have the space for a triple screen setup and you can afford it, I definitely would recommend that, because it definitely makes a massive difference over having a single larger screen. So that is point number 2. Monitor refresh rate, input lag, and response time make a much bigger difference than you think they do. Now, this is something that I kind of didn't realize for about 4 months of driving around in 4K resolution at 60 Hertz on my 55-inch TV. And it wasn't until I actually had the triple screens running at 100 Hertz that I really noticed the difference that having a higher refresh rate in particular makes. That's just your braking points, your turn-in points, your apexes and everything become a lot more accurate when you have a higher refresh rate. And around the sort of 100 Hertz to 120 Hertz mark seems to be about the sweet spot for sim racing, at least in my opinion. I've tried out monitors that run up to 144 Hertz and there wasn't really a discernible difference above about 100 Hertz for me at least, but definitely the difference between 60 Hertz and 100 Hertz is absolutely massive. And as I mentioned, it wasn't really something that I noticed until I had it, but I found that I was a lot more consistent in terms of my turn-in, my braking points, and hitting those apexes once I was running at 100 Hertz. Now, this is an interesting point when it comes to TVs in particular, because a lot of TVs are marketed as being 120 Hertz or 240 Hertz or even up to crazy numbers like 680 Hertz. I think I've even seen up to 1000 Hertz. Now, it's important to understand that TVs use a combination of backlight blinking and, frame interpolation and things like that to actually generate those refresh rates. So even though the monitor itself or the panel that is installed in that TV has a native refresh rate that might be very high, the actual input rate or frame rate that's coming into the TV via the PC is still limited to 60 Hertz with today's technology, regardless of the native refresh rate of the panel. So your TV can't actually display more than 60 Hertz in terms of what the signal that's actually coming in at 4K resolution. And what I actually ended up doing was lowering my resolution so that I was able to run 120 hertz. So I actually ended up going down to 1440 resolution. So I think it was 2560 by 1440 that I was running to get that 120 hertz refresh rate on the 55-inch TV, and I found that that made an absolutely massive difference. I was almost, in F1 2018 at least, which was the game that I was playing back then, I was almost a full half a second faster per lap just by making that change. So it really was a significant change. And again, I didn't really notice that until I was starting to sort of push my own limits and find, the limits of my own skill, and the limits of the hardware actually limiting my my speed moving forward. So something really important to understand there is that regardless of the refresh rate or the hertz that might be marketed on the TV that you're buying, you're still limited to 60 hertz in terms of the actual signal coming from the PC into the screen when you're running over HDMI at 4K resolution. So just keep that in mind, and yeah, you might want to look at actually getting a smaller screen that you're able to run at a higher resolution that actually look comfortable for your eyes, rather than getting a massive screen and having to have a pixelated view that is, all grainy and fuzzy because you're running a lower resolution on a larger screen. So just make sure you consider that. Now, it's also important to understand the difference between input lag and response time as well. And I'm only going to touch on this very briefly in this video. I'm going to do another video where I explain this in a lot more detail. But basically, response time is just measuring the time that it takes for the pixels on the actual panel itself to respond to a signal, whereas input lag actually accounts for the time it takes for the PC to process the input from your steering wheel or your pedals, the signal to actually be processed, the frames to be drawn, and then the picture engine inside the monitor to actually draw those frames, and then the actual pixels to change on the screen as well. So just because a TV or a monitor has a quoted low response time doesn't necessarily mean that the input lag is going to be low. So you do need to read your reviews. You do need to check. A lot of monitors, particularly cheaper ones like Kogan screens and things like that, they can advertise a really fast response time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the input lag is going to be low. So do make sure you check your reviews. Make sure that you're getting a screen that has the lowest possible input lag, because it really does make a massive difference. Okay, number 4, button layout is absolutely vitally important, particularly if you're playing sim racing titles that require you to do things like activate ERS, DRS, change fuel trims, and things like that while you're driving. Anything that makes you have to take your eyes off the road to make an adjustment or take your hands off the steering wheel is going to make you slower. Now, I was originally playing F1 2018 with a button box, which you can actually see up behind me, just behind my head, just there. It's hard to point while I'm looking at a camera, but just there. And then I also moved over to my Stream Deck, which you can see just beside me, just here. And I was using a control surface there. You can see the video that I did where I set all that up. And originally I was using that to change my ERS, my fuel trims and stuff like that. And what that meant was that every time I wanted to make a change to my fuel trim or something like that, I had to take my hand off the wheel and find the button and press it. Now, when I was using the button box, because that was a tactile adjustment, I could kind of feel what I was doing. So I didn't really have to take my eyes off the road so much. But what you'll find is that as you get faster, you're making more and more adjustments to your trims and things like that while you're driving. So it becomes absolutely vital to be able to do that without taking your eyes off the road and without taking your hands off the wheel. So often you'll be adjusting particularly your fuel trim or your ERS as you're actually braking into a turn. So you'll see in a lot of my sim racing streams and things like that, I'm actually flicking my thumbs on the little paddles on my Fanatec V2 Formula wheel while I'm braking, while I'm spotting my apexes and turning in. Now, if I wasn't able to do that with my thumbs, then I would be a lot slower. And we're talking, again, probably 0.3, 0.4, even 0.5 of a second slower that I found when I was actually using a button box as opposed to the wheel. So you want to make sure that you're choosing a steering wheel where possible. And obviously, it comes down to budget, but I would definitely recommend getting a wheel that has all the buttons that you're going to need as accessible as possible for things that you need to change while you're actually driving. Now, if you don't have a wheel that has thumb encoders or something like that, you can still use the buttons along the top, but you're definitely going to want to be able to set up buttons for things that you're going to be changing regularly while you're driving. So obviously that's going to depend on the software that you're using. For something like iRacing, it might be your brake bias or your fuel trim, things like that. F1, obviously, you're going to be doing things like your ERS management, things like that. But yeah, make sure that you do consider when you're buying a wheel that you want to be able to have as many buttons as possible in a position where you don't have to take your hands off the wheel. So even just having to use buttons in the center, the rotary encoders that are in the center of the wheel, you're still having to take your eyes off, kind of feel what's going on. So you want to have things as close to where your hands sit naturally while you're driving as possible. Rig rigidity makes a absolutely massive difference, particularly in braking. So the most important thing when you're braking in a sim is muscle memory. You find that over time you do start to learn exactly how much force you need to exert on the pedal, and it becomes more about the muscle memory than it does about, really thinking about what you're doing. So if you've got a rig that's flopping around and flexing and moving around a lot, it makes it really, really difficult to be consistent with your braking. Now, this is something that obviously it's going to come down to budget, but if you're buying a platform or a rig or a cockpit or whatever you want to call it, you definitely want to be considering where you're going to be going into the future. So if sim racing is something that you're going to be getting into more and more, and you're going to wanting to be upgrading your gear, then you definitely want to consider the rigidity of your platform. It's probably the single most important thing when it comes to spending money. If you have a tight budget, you want to be spending more money on your cockpit and probably less money on your wheel and other things than the other way around. You definitely need to have as much rigidity as possible, particularly in your pedal plate and your wheel platform. If things are moving around, it does make things difficult when it comes to setting muscle memory. Now, as well, there's a little bit of a slippery slope here when it comes to upgrading your gear, because you'll find as you upgrade your pedals in particular, the pedals become stiffer, particularly if you have a performance kit or a load cell braking system. You need that additional rigidity, but otherwise every time you press the pedal, either the pedals are going to slide, or if you're using an office chair or something like that rather than a cockpit, the seat is going to move back or swivel a little bit, and it becomes really, really difficult. And this is one of the things that I see all the time with beginners that have just bought expensive pedals, and then they find they can't use them properly because their chair's moving all over the place or their wheels moving all over the place, and it makes it really difficult and really disappointing. And I've seen a few people that have actually bought pedals and then ended up having to go back to their old cheap pedals because they simply can't use the load cell braking system while the pedals are sliding across the carpet or sliding across the floor or whatever. So you really do need to consider that it is an investment in the future. You are going to need to upgrade other gear to compensate for that additional quality in pedals and steering wheels and stuff like that. As well with, if you're getting a direct drive wheel, you need to make sure that you have a cockpit that can actually support that, and it's not going to be flapping around and vibrating and working its way loose during the course of a race. The last thing you want to have is, things getting loose or things breaking and falling off while you're driving. So definitely make sure that you consider the rigidity of your cockpit when you're choosing gear. Even if you think that you're only starting off now, I might just buy a $500 cockpit instead of a $700 cockpit or something like that, because I'm only sort of getting used to it now. Maybe look at the second-hand market or something like that. It's better to spend a little bit more, or go second-hand if you need to, but get the best quality cockpit that you can afford for the money that you have, because it really is going to make a massive difference, a much bigger difference than you think, particularly if you're using load cell brakes. Okay, so now we're moving more into making the most of the gear that you already have. So I'm not going to be encouraging you to spend more money from this point onwards, I promise. So the next point is regarding force feedback, motion, and things like that. If you have motion, this is obviously a thing that you need to spend a lot of time fine-tuning. But force feedback in particular, regardless of the wheel that you have, it doesn't matter if you've got a old G25 or a G27 or, a direct drive wheelbase, a Thrustmaster, whatever it is that you have, you need to take the time to fine-tune your force feedback settings to get the most realistic experience possible. And a lot of this does come down to personal preference as well. I see a lot of people jump into Facebook groups and forums and say, hey, what settings should I use for my wheel? And then they never touch it again. They just use somebody else's settings and they think that that's the best it can be. They never really dive into fine-tuning things. Now, obviously, it's great to start out with somebody else's suggestion, but everybody's driving style is a little bit different. Everybody's wheel is a little bit different. And you know, if you're not fine tuning it to your own personal preference, you're often missing out. Different people have different amounts of strength as well. Like, I mean, I'm not the most muscly guy in the world, so I tend to have my force feedback cranked down just a little bit, just so I'm able to really feel what's going on with the car. The detail is more important than the strength, and I think that's something that people miss a lot when it comes to the discussion between direct drive versus belt driven and things like that as well. And that's a topic for another discussion altogether. But yeah, look, definitely take the time to really fine tune your settings. Start off with somebody else's profile by all means, or jump on a forum and ask, but really take the time to make adjustments, trial and error, and you will find that there's a lot of frustration in doing this. Often, you know, you'll make some changes and the temptation is always there, especially if you've gotten used to the settings that you've been running for ages. You'll make some adjustments and you'll instantly be slower because you're having to relearn, you're having to, you know, reset that muscle memory. Just because you're slower originally doesn't mean that the settings are worse. You really do want to find a point where you're really comfortable, you really feel like you're feeling what's going on with the car. Those little tiny details in movement, the twitches in the car, feeling the ripple strips, feeling the braking, feeling understeer and oversteer, all those little details, you want to have those as accurate as you possibly can. And even if it makes you slower to begin with, once you get used to it, you will become faster. So that is a great way that you can get more out of the gear that you already have, and you don't necessarily need to spend a massive amount of money to become faster. I mean, I can give you an example of a guy that had a problem with his wheel last season in the competition that I was doing, and I actually ended up sending him my old Logitech G27, which isn't exactly regarded as a high quality wheel. And he actually ended up winning the championship against guys that were using, you know, $10,000, $15,000 cockpits. You know, and he's just using a tiny little monitor with a G27, and yet he was still able to win the championship with that setup. So, you know, taking the time to really set things up and get things as accurate as possible really is worth the time investment, even if you feel like you're slower and you're getting frustrated to begin with. Okay, so this one's probably going to get a few people triggered, but guys, don't pay too much attention to people's opinion in Facebook groups, Discord channels, you know, forums, all those places. At the end of the day, what you enjoy and what brings you fun and entertainment is what's important. So, I mean, I've copped a lot of flack in the comments online as well as in Facebook groups because of the amount of time that I've spent playing F1 2018. And yes, I understand that it's not the most accurate sim out there, but I enjoy it, and that's what matters. So guys, if you have a particular title that you enjoy, you know, don't be afraid to, you know, just enjoy that and share it and, you know, experience it. Don't feel like, oh, well, if you've got an expensive rig or a lot of gear, you have to be playing a certain title just because that's what people say you need to do. I've found that I've gotten so much enjoyment out of, you know, F1 2018, to use that as an example, just by having this gear. And even though maybe that software doesn't take full advantage of all the gear that I have, I've still found it more immersive and more enjoyable. And, you know, different people enjoy different aspects of sim racing and different things. Like, I like the fact that F1 2018 has all the genuine livery from the real cars. I like the aspect of the career mode having things like, you know, needing to answer the right questions in the right way. I kind of enjoy that management side of things. And, you know, it really doesn't matter what other people think. So, you know, by all means, follow people's suggestions and try things out. But, you know, don't get caught up in the drama. Don't think that, you know, a certain piece of software sucks just because a few people said it did. At the end of the day, if you're enjoying it, that is what matters. Okay guys, so if you don't listen to any of the other points in the video, please pay attention to this one. For the love of God, join an online racing league. Find yourself a good league where you can get involved in the community. Find a good bunch of guys and girls that you can race with. You will have so much more fun than you do in open lobbies and single player mode. You'll improve your racing skills, but above all, you'll just do away with a lot of the frustration that comes from, you know, people just cannonballing into turn one, people taking you out and not having any regard for the welfare of other drivers. There's also the community aspect of it as well. Just being a part of a community, enjoying chatting to your mates, building reputation and building relationships with other racers it brings such a lot to the overall experience of sim racing. And on the whole, the majority of people in the sim racing community are awesome people that are willing to help you improve your skills, improve your racecraft, all that kind of thing. And it really is so much more fun than just jumping in an open lobby and getting taken out in every single race. And I actually find that for the large part, I actually enjoy the community aspect of it more than the actual racing itself. I've made some really awesome friends in the sim racing community. So if you are playing in open lobbies, that's fine to get used to the physics of the game and things like that, but get into a league. You'll also find that it improves your driving as well, because you're jumping in with people that are varying in their skill levels, rather than going into open lobbies where the people are generally around the same sort of skill level as you are or slower. You find that by challenging yourself and racing against a few people that are a little bit faster, a few people a little bit slower, so you're having to sort of deal in traffic and things like that, overall it's going to make you a much better racing. So I'll link to a couple of leagues that I recommend in the description below, but do some shopping around, ask in Facebook groups, try some things out, and look, don't get caught up in the drama that is often present in online leagues as well. Just enjoy the racing, become a part of the community, share your passion for sim racing, and have a good time. So this one is one that I honestly wish I'd paid more attention to you guys in the comments on YouTube originally. I resisted turning off assists and racing line for so long, simply because I guess I was scared of being slow. I didn't want to, absolutely suck when I was live streaming. I didn't want to embarrass myself in front of you guys by being slow. And so I left the racing line on in particular for ages. I did turn off most of the other assists pretty quickly, like ABS and traction control and stuff like that. But the racing line really does limit your improvement. You'll find that what you're doing is you're paying attention to the line rather than actually learning proper braking points. And what that means is that when you jump in other titles, so I was playing F1 2018 primarily, and then as soon as I jumped into another title, I just couldn't drive it because the racing line worked differently and I wasn't looking for the correct braking markers. I was trying to do things like use shadows to spot my braking markers, and then obviously throughout the course of a race, those shadows would change and I'd end up just sucking. So you really do need to develop good habits from the onset. If you're using the racing line all the time in particular, you're never going to develop those good habits, and you start to set muscle memory that is incorrect. It's a lot like learning an instrument. When you just learn off making your own mistakes and reading a book, you pick up bad habits that you then don't break. It's much better to have those professional lessons right from the start when you're learning an instrument, because it makes you, develop good habits from the onset. And it's very much similar here. If you're using assistance, you really start to develop these bad habits that become a lot more difficult to break later on. So, even though you might be a little bit embarrassed and you might feel like you suck to begin with, you will get used to it very quickly. And I found it only took me, maybe 5 or 6 hours of driving without the racing line to really sort of get back to the same point where I was. And I'm finding now that I'm actually, I'm braking a little bit earlier, I'm getting better exit speed, and I'm sure that over the course of the next couple of weeks, I'm going to end up being a lot faster. But it also adds a lot to the level of immersion as well. It makes it a lot more enjoyable, and you really do feel a much greater sense of accomplishment and achievement and exhilaration when you get a good lap with no assists. It really is a lot more fun. In particular, if you've got a rig that's got, force feedback and a motion platform, triple screens, and, really immersive, setup, you want to have it as realistic as possible, and using assists really doesn't help with that. So guys, the temptation's always there to leave them switched on, but switch them off, give it a go. I promise you'll have a lot more fun, and you ultimately will be a lot faster with no assists. Alright, so that brings us to our final point, which is don't be afraid to compete with people that are faster than you. If you're always at the front of the pack, or you're always winning or coming first, second, or third, you're not challenging yourself and you're not going to improve your skills as fast. The temptation is always there to limit yourself, turning down the AI if you're playing in single player mode so that you always win. And that was something that I always found I was tempted to do. I always enjoyed the thrill of, competing near the front, challenging for first place. And it wasn't until I actually started to turn up the AI and racing classes against, online players that were faster than me that I really started to improve my skills. And you guys that have been watching my streams would have seen that I'm competing in Tier 1, which is some of the fastest guys in Australia in F1 2018 at the moment. And, you know, I suck compared to those guys. I mean, last night's race, I got lapped almost twice by the leader in Monaco. And I ended up pulling over and letting most of the field pass. But you know what? I was following people around. I was enjoying it. And it's setting a benchmark. I'm seeing those lap times that are 2 or 3 seconds faster than me. And it's motivating me to push harder. Whereas if I'm winning, I'm thinking, oh yeah, I'm fast, I'm good. And I'm not really pushing myself and challenging myself. So it's so much more fun to challenge yourself and really battle in that midfield to the back of the field. Even if you're dead last, you're challenging yourself to go faster. And it's so much more enjoyable when you do make up those couple of places and you start to get faster and faster and people start to recognize that you're improving your skills as well. And if you're always at the front of the pack in a group of people that are slower than you, you're never really going to enjoy it because you know that there are people out there that are faster than you and you know that you're not really challenging yourself. So if you're racing offline, don't be afraid to crank that AI up. And if you're online, don't be afraid to race against people that are faster than you. Ultimately, you will have more fun, you will improve your driving, and you will have a better time. So guys, that is my list of top 10 things that I wish that I'd known before I got into and spent any money on sim racing. Hopefully you guys have found some interesting tidbits of information in there regardless of where you're at in your journey. So whether you're completely new to sim racing and just wondering, what sort of gear you should be looking at getting, how much money you're going to need to spend, whether you've already got some gear and you just want to get the most out of it, ultimately it's all about having fun and enjoying what you have. So you don't need to spend an absolute fortune to have a good time sim racing, and you don't need to spend a fortune to be competitive either. I think that's probably the main takeaway from this, is that you can have a lot of fun. You can be fast. You can be competitive with a small investment. You don't need to have a setup like this. Obviously, but you don't need to go all out and spend tens of thousands of dollars like I have to get a good experience. So guys, I hope you found this video interesting and useful. If you have, hit the thumbs up button, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell as well so you don't miss the next video. And I will see you guys on the track. Bye.